Warning: the following episode contains adult language and adult themes. Viewer and listener discretion is advised. This content is recommended for adults age 21 and over.
The first thing I remember seeing was a bunch of white-haired old women dead by a bus stop. And I was like, this cannot fucking be true. This is some kind of sick prank. I mean, these were like 75-year-old women waiting for somebody to pick them up to go play squash or something, tennis. And they're clearly dead. I mean, there's blood all over the place, and they've been shot in the head.
Welcome to the perfect society where Republicans and Democrats get their way, and so does everybody else. I'm Curt Derby. Thank you for joining me. I have with me today Elizabeth Emery Shemesh. She has come across the ocean to visit us here in the United States. Liz, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So today is part of our In the Shadows series, and In the Shadows is where we talk about topics that are not covered very much in the mainstream media, if at all, and also might not even be covered in the new media. Now, this episode is very special because our topics are very much in both media, new and old. But having my pre-interview with Liz, I have a feeling we're going to learn a lot of things that we're not being talked about. So let's dive in. Liz, you came to the United States almost exactly a year ago today, October 7th, 2023. Tell us why you came over.
Yeah, it was actually about a week and a half that we got here after October 7th happened.
Oh, pardon.
We'll talk about that because we left long before we arrived, and it took us a long time to get here, but we'll talk about that, I think. So I came here with my two sons. They're twins, and at the time they were 7 months old. And we came because on October 7th, I think as most people know now, there was a really horrible attack on Israel from Hamas in Gaza. And, now we know the statistics of how many people died and how many people were dragged back into Gaza. But at the time, and this was very unclear, and a lot was happening and a lot was changing. And our concern as parents was not so much the threat from Gaza, but more of the threat with Hezbollah up on the northern border. And we'll talk more about those. Those are two separate groups, but they very much work together and have the same goals. And when Hamas did the attack out of Gaza, they were hoping to trigger like a joint attack from not only Hezbollah, but also Hamas and Hezbollah are very active in the West Bank, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. There's a lot of jihadi groups all surrounding Israel, and they were hoping to trigger what they thought would be the end of Israel. And it was not clear at all if that was going to happen, especially because the attack happened on October 7th, and then on October 8th, Hezbollah started attacking northern Israel. And so we thought, okay, if this is going to be the kind of existential war that Israel fought in 1967 during the Six-Day War, or in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, that we better get the kids out, because Hezbollah's arsenal is not anymore because of the last few weeks, but at the time was absolutely formidable, a formidable fighting force, and we were really afraid. So
I can imagine.
The U.S.
I can't even imagine what you went through. So for people like me who might not have all the terminology down, so Gaza is a piece of land, and then Israel is next to the land, and there's an ocean or a sea next to Israel. Pardon my ignorance.
Yeah.
Is that about right? So
yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And is Gaza where Palestine is? Or is Gaza the entire area where Israel and Palestine are?
So let me give you perhaps a sort of a geographical layout, if that would be helpful. Okay, so if you're looking straight on at Israel, and this is north and this is south, what you'll see is that you have the Mediterranean Sea to the west, and then you have Israel, and to Israel's east, you have the West Bank. And Israel is sort of shaped I don't know if you can maybe see my necklace. This is the shape of Israel. It's long and skinny. It's about the size and shape of New Jersey. Okay. So the Gaza Strip is way down on the southwest side. So if you look south of Israel, you have Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, which is part of Egypt. And then you have the Red Sea. And then if you look again to the east of Israel, you've got the West Bank. And then the country to the east of that is Jordan. And then to the north of Israel, you have Lebanon. And then there's a tiny little strip of land that runs kind of between Lebanon and Egypt to Israel's northeast. That is Syria. And then that opens up into Syria. Okay, so when we talk about Israel, what we're talking about is the land of Israel that doesn't include the land where most of the Palestinians live, which is the West Bank and Gaza. So Hamas was elected to, and this was 20 years ago now, in the first democratic elections that the Palestinians had in Gaza. They were elected as the leadership of Gaza, as the political leadership of Gaza, okay? And in the West Bank, the leadership in the West Bank is a group called Fatah, and they are the Palestinian Authority. And when Hamas won the elections in the West Bank, they spent the next year or two purging Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, either by killing them or by pushing them into exile. Okay, and so Hamas totally dominates Gaza, and the West Bank is ruled by the Palestinian Authority, who works very closely with Israel on security measures because, as I said before, Hamas and Hezbollah also have a presence in the West Bank. And so between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, they are working with Israel, kind of. It's a lot more complicated than that, which we can also go into later, to sort of control the more radical Islamic jihadi elements in the West Bank. Now, the West Bank is also complicated because Israeli Jews also live in the West Bank. And so you hear a lot of criticism of Israel in terms of the settlements. And when they're talking about settlements, they're talking about Jewish cities that are in the West Bank. And some of those are legal, some of them are not. It depends on who you ask and how they interpret international law, but that's like the situation in the West Bank. The West Bank is also under Israeli military occupation. And again, whether or not it's technically an occupation depends on who you talk to and how they interpret international law. Some people argue that it's not an occupation because there was never a legitimate national entity. And also, like, occupations are not necessarily illegal, right? The United States occupied Germany for a very long time after World War II. And the Israeli military occupation, although it's incredibly restrictive on the Palestinians, is there because of events like the Second Intifada. And we'll get more into this later, I'm sure. But it's important to know that there are plenty of Jewish Israelis in the West Bank, and that's a cause of some of the tension. And then to the north of Israel, in Lebanon, that is where Hezbollah is. And sometimes you will hear that, like, Hezbollah and Israel are disagreeing over some of the territorial waters and over certain little tiny pieces of land, like Sheba Farms. In my opinion, those aren't legitimate territorial disagreements. Like, for example, because Sheba Farms never belonged to Lebanon, it always belonged to Syria, and also because Hezbollah doesn't have any authority to be negotiating on the part of Lebanon because they're not the government there. There's a separate Lebanese government there, but Hezbollah is such a powerful military and political force, and they aren't in Israel. They're in Lebanon, but you can't really understand what's going on right now if you don't understand that geography also plays a really important role in what's going on here.
So and again, pardon me, it seems like four groups there. So there's Israel, which are Israelis, and mostly Jews?
Mostly.
Okay. And then Palestine, which is Palestinians, and they control a certain area in Gaza, but Hamas is actually really the ruling group of Hamas
in Gaza. Yes,
in Gaza?
They control all of Gaza. Israel completely pulled out of the Gaza Strip in 2005 and 2006.
Okay.
Yeah, so they completely, Hamas is the only one in charge of Gaza. And then in the West Bank, you have the Palestinian Authority, and then you have the little militant groups that are Hamas and Hezbollah, but they're not part of the political group in the West Bank. Certain parts of the West Bank are completely under the Palestinian Authority. Some are sort of dually administered between Israel and they're under civil control of the Palestinian Authority, but under military control of Israel. And then you have the parts that are under military and civilian control of Israel, and those are the settlements.
Okay. So
Yes.
it sounds like there's a whole lot of groups
And that's like
in charge, controlling.
completely. And that's like
Some get along,
scratching
some don't.
the surface. Yes, because when you sort of break down each of these groups further, a full 20% of Israelis are Arab, right, of Palestinian descent. They consider themselves Israeli Arabs or Israeli Palestinians or Palestinian Israelis. It depends on who you ask. But they are there because they lived there, or their families lived there during Israel's initial founding. And of those, you have Muslims, you have Christians, you have Druze, which is a small kind of Muslim Arab. It's more complicated than that, but they're very loyal to Israel. A lot of these people serve in the IDF, whatever. And then if you go up into Lebanon, they're made of Shiite Muslims, Sunni Muslims, Christians, Alawites, and it's very complicated.
Wow.
It's not just Arab Muslims versus Israeli Jews, or even versus, living together. There's lots and lots of different groups that live together.
And I've heard there's Christians over there, but I think maybe a lot of us in the U.S. might only think it's Israel and the Jews and everybody else is Muslim.
Yeah,
But that's not
exactly.
the case.
Exactly. Not at all.
That's not the
Perhaps
case.
you've heard of this town called Bethlehem, a little
Yeah.
town called Bethlehem. That is, of course, a very important town in Christian ideology and or the Christian religion. And it used to be primarily Christians. It's not anymore. This doesn't get much coverage, but Christians have been heavily persecuted throughout the Arab world, including in Palestine. And so there's nowhere near as many Arab Christians. If you're Arab, it just means you speak Arabic. So you could be Arab Muslim, Arab Christian. Yeah. So there's not as many Arab Christians in either the West Bank or Gaza or Lebanon as there used to be, but they're also an important group there.
Well, and at least there's probably not as many as we know because they don't want to publicly say they're Christians because Muslims don't take too kindly to Christians over there or anywhere, really.
In many cases, that's true. I think if you're now, I'm not the person to ask for wonderful details about this, but if you're, an Arab Christian living in the West Bank, you're living openly as an Arab Christian in the West Bank. Likewise, if you're, if you're an Arab Christian living in Israel, you're living openly as such. And but I guess to your point, there's so many groups in the area, and by and large, they get along, especially in Israel. But there's obviously really important differences.
And I caught from what little I do watch the news. I feel like Israel is kind of the peaceful, safe place generally, and everything outside there is generally hostile to them.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And then, so Hamas did this attack October 7th?
Right.
And then you and your two twins, that's a little redundant. You and your twin sons came over a week later.
Right.
Why did they attack Israel?
Well, if you listen to what they say, which I think is the most important way to understand why they're doing what they do, they did it because their goal, and this is very clear not only in terms of what their political leaders say, what their military leaders say, but also it's stated very explicitly in their charter, their goal is to destroy Israel. Part of the reason that this conflict has been going on for as long as it has is there has never been a Palestinian political leader who has said, okay, whatever happened in the 20s and 30s and 40s, it happened. It was ugly. It was terrible for a lot of different people, not least of which were the Jews, right? It was a really terrible period across the entire world. We can't undo that. We have to learn to live together. We've never seen a Palestinian leader say that, never. And Hamas says quite the opposite, that we will never accept the presence of a Jewish state, that all of this land belongs to the Palestinians. And to that end, Hamas controls Gaza. The Palestinians get literally billions of dollars of international aid on an annual basis, right? The entire world gives the Palestinians money. And you will often hear that Israel controls everything that comes in and out of the Gaza Strip. That's clearly not true, or this attack never would have happened, right? And And so instead of taking care of their people and building a peaceful society and putting that money towards education and engineering and agriculture, they build it, or they put it towards building an almost unbelievably complicated and large network of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip, and towards bringing in weapons and missiles and just smuggling in as much as they possibly could through the border with Egypt. And they did that because they believe that it is only a matter of time until Israel ceases to exist. And the most important thing that you can do if you're a young man in Gaza is to give your life up to the cause. And that's what they did when they came in on October 7th. All those guys coming in, there's no doubt that they thought that they were going to be victorious. There's also no doubt that they knew that most of them were going to die. I mean, they know that, right? So this is part of their ideology. So that's why they did it.
Okay, and again, to be clear, so Hamas started the attack or Palestine started the attack?
Hamas started the attack.
Okay.
Yes.
And Palestine, because I think you said Palestine has like the political power, but Hamas has strong military presence?
Palestinian Authority. So again, it depends on where you're talking about. In Gaza, Hamas is both the political and the military authority.
Okay.
In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is the political and military authority, but then there's also smaller like jihadi groups like Hamas and Hezbollah in the West Bank. So Hamas completely dominates the Gaza Strip, like completely. And the things that they do to their political rivals in the Gaza Strip never make the news, but they're absolutely heinous. And we can talk about that later when we talk about perhaps what is going to happen after, like the day after this is over. But yeah, it was Hamas that did the attack. And within the Gaza Strip, like you will see often an effort to separate the Palestinians from Hamas. And the people that you see trying to do that are mostly Americans and other people in the West who go, oh, not all Palestinians support Hamas. That's not true. Well, it is true that not all Palestinians support Hamas, but within the Palestinian population in Gaza, there's about 40% of the people there, men and women, who completely unequivocally support Hamas and their mission. They're willing to train their sons to die for the cause, no matter how much destruction and how much death comes to the Gaza Strip. They are not willing to say, okay, the strategy clearly isn't working. Maybe we should try something else. No, they support Hamas. And to that end, you know, a lot of times you'll hear Hamas discussed as though they're some like ragtag jihadi group, and they're not. They're not only an organized political entity, they're a highly organized, highly armed, somewhat incompetent military entity. And when they evaded Israel, it was a military invasion. I mean, they're divided into battalions and squadrons, and they're extremely well armed. And it was Hamas primarily that did this. And then after there were something like 4,000 or 5,000 Hamas fighters. I think now they're saying it was closer to 5,000. There was also a significant number of Gazan civilians that came in across the border, and they participated in the looting and the killing, and then also in dragging hostages back to Gaza. So while it is true, I don't think you can say with a blanket statement that any group of people believes anything, right? Yeah. You can say that about 40% of the people who live in the Gaza Strip support Hamas. And Hamas is the one that did the attack on October 2nd.
Gotcha. And the other 60% just are against violence and or they're pro-Israel? What are the other 60%?
No, they're not pro-Israel at all. I think perhaps they're for sure less willing to use the kind of violence that we saw on October 7th. Here's the problem. We don't really know how much the rest of the Palestinian population in Gaza supports peace, because you can imagine what happens. Well, you don't have to imagine it. I mean, there's so many stories, tragic stories of Palestinians who advocate for peace, and they're dragged out into the public square. Their arms and their legs are broken. They're beaten to a pulp, and then they're shot in the head, and then they're hung upside down from a telephone pole. They're made an example out of. So, I mean, to the extent that I have no doubt that there's a lot of Palestinians in Gaza who are saying, oh my God, this again, like we don't want, even if they don't, there's no love lost between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But there's a lot of people who I think don't want to see this happen. The problem is, if you dare to speak out about it, you don't live much longer.
Sure. And Hamas is kind of the big tough guy in the area. And whatever they say,
Completely.
Whatever they want to do, they're going to do.
Completely.
Gotcha.
Completely. Even to the point that as Israel's trying to figure out, like, right, so they've gone in, they've pretty much militarily destroyed Hamas. Hamas is no longer functioning as a military body. At this point, it's mostly just going to be counterinsurgency. So now we're talking about, okay, so who's going to be in charge of the Gaza Strip now? It's not going to be Hamas. They want it to be, but Israel's not going to let that happen. So there's a lot of other, like so much of the Arab world is sort of divided not only into, religious and ethnic groups, but they're also clans. They're really powerful family clans, right? So you have these clans in the Gaza Strip who I wouldn't say they're necessarily good people in the way that you and I might think about that, right? They're in charge of a lot of drug running and weapons running, but they are powerful and they have money and there's a lot of them. So there's one family in particular that Israel was talking to about like how interested are you in helping govern the Gaza Strip when this is all over? And they showed some interest. And Hamas entered the family compound and they beheaded the family leaders. So that's how powerful they are, right? And they're also doing this because they're sending a message. Don't fuck with us. Like, don't even think about it. We're in charge and you don't want to mess with that. Well, they're a really tough group of people to deal with.
Gotcha. Okay, if you don't mind backing up a second. So it's my understanding Israel became a nation in 1949. I mean, we hear of Israel in the Bible, so 2,000 years ago, but they actually didn't have their own country until 1949, or was it lost at some point? Is there, or maybe I'm just off base.
Not
is
at
19?
all.
Okay, is 19? What is 1948?
1948.
Okay,
1948.
What happened then?
So can I back up even a little bit further?
Sure.
Okay. So to your point, we all know in the Bible there was the kingdom of Judea and the kingdom of Samaria, right? That's where we get the Jews from, is Judea. So that land belonged to the Jews, and that was, of course, split up into different groups of Jews. But over many years, the area is it's an area of really strategic importance because it's really the area where a number of important empires meet, right? We have the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, and then you have the Byzantines, and you have the Persian Empire, and then you have the Egyptians, and the area that Israel's in is like right in the middle of all of that. And so
geographically, it's a prime piece of land.
Oh, completely.
Okay.
Not because it's so great for farming or industry or anything like
just
that.
Just the location. To everything else.
Right. And let's not kid ourselves. Like if Israel disappeared tomorrow, this area would be at war for the next 2,000 years like it's been for the last 2,000 years,
Gotcha.
right? Okay.
Gotcha.
So over the course of the last 2,000 years, and really we're talking about like 50 AD, 70 AD, 200 AD, there were invasions of various empires that took over the area and pushed the Jews out. And in some cases, the Jews were more successful at fighting them. At some cases, the Jews were less successful at fighting them. Anyone who wants to know a little bit about this could Google Masada, which was part of King Herod's temple, and like the last holdout. There's a remote hill next to the Dead Sea where sort of the last vestiges of Jews gathered and then ultimately killed themselves as they were besieged by the Romans. And the reason that it was called Palestine is because after the Romans had fought the Jews, over and over and over again, and the Jews just would not be put down, they kept fighting, they finally pretty much beat them completely and renamed the area Palestine. And that was sort of a fuck you to the Jews, to say like, this isn't your land anymore and you're not coming back. And the Jews were then, this is like the biggest, like most condensed crash course you possibly have. So, it's much more complicated than this, but then Jews were dispersed to wherever they could go and live. So some of those Jews went to Spain, which is where you see the beginning of European Jewry. And some of those Jews were in the Persian Empire, and some of them were pushed further east, and some of them were pushed further south. And so what you see over the course of the next 2,000 years is groups of Jews living all over the world, primarily concentrated in Europe and the Middle East. And so then over the course of that time, there were many, you're familiar with this term pogrom. I'm sure you've heard that before. Okay, so the term pogrom is a word that specifically means the persecution of Jews wherever it is that they live. Okay, so there's famous pogroms.
Can I stop you real quick?
Sure.
Why? What's the deal? Is it religious? You said it might be ethnic. Like, why the hatred for 2,000 years?
There's so many answers to that question. Actually, can we shelve that question?
Sure.
Because it's a really good question.
Sure.
So over the years, the Jews have just had to move. They've been expelled from Spain. They've been expelled from different parts of Europe many times. They've been expelled from different parts of the Middle East. And never did they have like full equal rights to wherever they were living. And we'll answer that question why later on when we talk about why so much hatred towards the Jews. But there would be these periodic pogroms where you would often see Jews. They tend to do very well wherever they go because they're highly literate, right?
They work hard.
They work their asses off. Their cultural values lend themselves to success everywhere they go.
Sure.
And so what you will see is like the Jews are a very useful population to have up until the point where they become threatening because they become more wealthy or become more powerful, and that breeds resentment. And okay, I'm sort of answering your other question right now. All to say that there's periodically these pogroms against the Jews wherever they go. Okay. And in the late 1800s and 1900s, these pogroms against the Jews, particularly in what is now Ukraine and Poland and Russia, were so ugly and so awful. You began to see the emergence of a political movement called Zionism. And Zionism now is often used as not only a replacement for Jew, because you can't say you dirty fucking Jew anymore, but you can say you colonialist, fucking Zionist, you genocidal piece of, like, that's totally fine, right? You can say that. And so not only is Zionist...
Sounds friendlier, for sure.
Oh, for sure. Right. So not only do we use Zionist more often now in that term, but that's not what Zionism is, and it's not how it began. Zionism was a response to the pogroms against the Jews in Europe in the late 18th and 19th century. And... the late 19th, yeah, and early 20th century. And it was a desire on the part of Jewish community leaders who were saying, hang on a second, this has been happening for the last 2,000 years. It never stops. It doesn't make any sense. It's not rational. It's completely unpredictable. And when these pogroms happen, so many people die. And we can't defend ourselves because we don't have weapons. We don't have an army. All we have is these small groups of Jews who all have to live in the same place because we're not really allowed to integrate. And even when we are, it doesn't last for very long. What we need is a country of our own. And when we talk about Jews, you have to understand that not only is Judaism a religion, and to some extent it's also an ethnicity, but it's also a nationality, the same way that Americans are from America and Germans are from Germany and the Japanese are from Japan. Jews are from Israel. Okay, they're the Jewish people. And Zionism was the political vision and social vision that in order to stop this from happening over and over and over again, what Jews needed was a country of their own.
Gotcha.
Okay, so early Zionist leaders are looking around and going, where the hell are we going to put everybody? First of all, how do you convince Jews from all over the world to move to a certain area? And where could you possibly go? And I think in the Jewish heart and in Jewish scripture and in Jewish prayer for the last 2,000 years, there has always been a yearning to return to the land of Israel, right? That like every year as part of the Passover Seder, like the dinner you have, at the end you say next year in Jerusalem. Jews have been saying that for thousands of years. So I think the place that they really wanted to go was back to what was then called Palestine. But they would have taken other options. There was some discussion of doing it in Uganda. There was some discussion of doing it actually in Galveston, Texas. And those didn't work out for a variety of reasons. But basically, you saw the early Zionist movement saying, okay, like, we're not safe here. We've got to go. And Jews slowly started moving to Palestine and buying land, right? It's not like the Jews came and they were like, all right, we're here, get out. That never would have worked because there weren't that many of them also. But that just wasn't the Jewish ethic. And so they started moving to Israel from mostly Eastern Europe at the time, because you think in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, Jews are fairly well integrated in Western Europe. We all know how that ended, but that's what was going on at the time, right? And so Jews in Western Europe were like, this is ridiculous, we're not doing this. There weren't very many people who were interested in it, but the Jews in Eastern Europe were increasingly saying, this is getting really dangerous, we got to go. Okay. So they start buying land and cultivating the land in areas where it was owned by Arab landowners, but was farmed by poor Arabs, right? So the Arab landowners don't live there. They own the land, and it's farmed by poor Arabs. And the Jews start coming in and they start buying this land. And then, of course, the Arabs that are farming it have to leave. Okay, and that sucks for them. So you start to see like the seeds of resentment happening there.
Why did they have to leave? Because they didn't own the land anymore.
They didn't own the land anymore.
Okay.
Yeah. And the Jews were living there and they were farming and they were developing it.
I'm with you. Got it.
Yeah. And there have always been, albeit fairly small, a Jewish presence throughout Palestine, Jerusalem, Hebron, and these different cities. The Jews that were living in Palestine at the time, you will often hear people say that Jews were treated equally and welcomed with open arms in the Arab world, which is just simply not true. I think compared to certain other places at certain times, they faced less persecution for sure, but they certainly didn't face no persecution, and they were definitely subject to pogroms. And there were certain things that they just weren't allowed to do, like they couldn't ride a horse sitting forward. They had to ride on the horse sitting sideways or the donkey sitting sideways because dignified men sat on their horse facing forward, and Jews were not dignified, right? They had what's called dhimmi status. They were second-class citizens, okay? And again, it wasn't as bad to be a Jew in Jerusalem in the late 1800s as it was to be a Jew in Ukraine, but it wasn't great. And the Jews were very poor, and they were not politically enfranchised at all. So there you begin to see the seeds of like the Zionist movement taking root, and then things in Europe get worse, and then they get worse, and then they get worse, and then the Holocaust starts. And during World War I, the British were basically managing the area. It's much more complicated than this. And you had a lot of pushback from the Arabs towards the British. And you had a lot of pushback from the Jews towards the British because the British were not letting Jews come into the area. They wanted to restrict Jewish immigration because the more Jews came, the more Arabs became upset, and the Brits were trying to manage it and didn't want, things to get out of control. And so you saw a lot of Arab and Jewish, what we would consider now, I think, terrorism, fighting the Brits and trying to push them out, the Arabs, because they wanted to manage their land themselves, and the Jews wanted to push them out because they needed to get people out of Europe. And anyway, more and more Jews come in. We have the Holocaust. Not very many Jews were let into the land during the Holocaust. And in fact, the Brits actually turned away a significant number of Jewish refugees who were then sent back and killed in concentration camps. World War II ends, and in large part because the Brits were mostly pushed out and because there was, the world had sort of realized, the Jewish world had realized how horrible what had happened during the Holocaust was. You saw a massive influx of money of help, like to try to help Jews come into Palestine from Europe. And so more and more Jews are arriving. You start seeing these like really serious skirmishes between Jews and Arabs, right? And the Jews are like, you just tried to kill all of us. We're literally fighting for our lives here. We're either going to die or we're staying here. And the Arabs were like, this isn't your land. This is Muslim land. This is Palestine. And at the same time, the UN, or at the time it was the League of Nations, and the Brits are sort of trying to figure out, how do we help the Jews and the Arabs who are both here? Okay, so can we split the land and give some of it to the Arabs and some of it to the Jews? And every time there's a proposal like this, the Jews are like, great, we'll take it. We'll literally take anything. And the Arabs are like, absolutely not. Okay, so finally the Brits are like, this is too crazy. We're out of here. We're leaving. You guys basically figure it out for yourselves. And we see a civil war erupt between the Jews and the Arabs. And it wasn't just the Arabs that were living in Palestine against the Jews that were now there. It was the Arabs in Lebanon and the Arabs in Jordan and the Arabs in Egypt, because from the Arab perspective, like once land is Muslim land, it stays Muslim land. You don't give it to the Jews. And the Jews have actually always been second-class citizens. So no, we're not going to give them equal rights. A lot of that is religious. A lot of it is cultural. And a lot of it is due to the fact that during World War II, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was working hand in hand with Hitler to help the final solution. A lot of people don't know that. So there was sort of this transport of Hitler-style anti-Semitism over into this. So all of this is working together. And in 1948, the Jews who were sort of the leadership of the region at the time, Theodor Herzl and Menachem Begin, and there's a ton of disagreement among them, but Theodor Herzl basically goes, we're going to do it now or we're never going to do it. We're establishing the state. So in 1948, they establish the state. Immediately thereafter, all the Arab armies attack. Israel wins. Okay. And in the process of winning, or in the process of the fighting, a huge number of Palestinians are either, the people with money leave first, as always happens during war, right? So people leave thinking that they're going to be able to come back. A huge portion of them are invited to leave by the surrounding Arab armies with the understanding that once the Arab armies kill all the Jews, then they'll go back. And then finally, when it became clear that Israel was winning, there was for sure, some people call it ethnic cleansing. I think that's probably a fair term to use. It wasn't a thorough ethnic cleansing because 1 in 5 Israelis was and is Arab. But there was no question that the Israeli leadership at the time said we've got to have a Jewish majority, because if we don't have that, we're going to have a hostile Arab fifth column, and our project is never going to get off the ground. So there for sure is, a push of Arabs out of the region just because they're Arab Palestinians and not Jews. Now, from the perspective of the Arabs, all of this is incredibly unfair. A lot of them now. The war that they started against Israel was a war of genocide. I mean, the point was to completely destroy the nascent Jewish state, but Israel won that, and the Arabs have basically been continuing to wage that war ever since. So that's
in addition to the previous 1900 years.
Yeah, to some extent, right? There were no Arab Muslims until the 700s and 800s, because Islam didn't exist until then, and then there was this giant expansion. But yes, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a mess.
What a mess. And there's been several massive wars since then, none of which Israel started. We had the Six-Day War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War in 1973. That was the last really, really big one, but there's been lots of small, there was the wars with Lebanon, and yeah. It's been ugly.
And then, wow. And then, so last year starts another one.
Right.
Or they just thought they were going to wipe them out. Like, this is the time.
Yeah.
We're finally going to get rid of, and that failed.
Yes.
So Hamas is now pretty much decimated.
Right.
Is the war, and pardon me for trying to oversimplify, but is it officially over, or is there still fighting going on? I mean, I know there's still bad feelings, or have been for centuries.
Right. I don't think this war, I think in the United States and in the West in general, we're very focused on problem solving, which is not a bad thing, right? But we look at the situation between Israel and its neighbors, and we think, how can we solve this problem? And I can tell you right now, the problem is never going to be fully solved. You are never going to have a world where Arabs and Jews love to live next to each other. It's not going to happen. There's too much history. There's too many grievances. Okay, maybe in 3,000 years it'll happen. I don't know. But for the next generation or two at least, you're going to have enormous amounts of hostility and mistrust. And so in sort of the existential sense, the war is not over. It's not going to be over.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Okay, but that doesn't mean that the hostility is never going to cease, right? So, as I said before, I think basically in the Gaza Strip, Israel is now running counterinsurgency operations against Hamas with the goal to completely remove them from military and political dominance. I don't think you completely get rid of Hamas, but you can get pretty close. And they're pretty close. And then we have to talk about the rebuilding of the Gaza Strip and what that's going to look like, and that's a whole separate mess of its own. Okay, but then you have to remember we have what's going on up at the northern border. And this is what my husband and I took the kids out of Israel for. So again, if we can zoom out for a little bit here, way over to the northeast of Israel is Iran. And Iran is an interesting country for a few reasons. One, it's the continuation sort of the Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire has a long and rich history of art and culture, and the Persians are a pretty sophisticated people. But in 1970, the radical Islamic Ayatollah regime came into power, and they've been in power for the last 50 years. And in part because Iran is Shia and Persian, and the rest of its neighbors are Sunni Arab, Iran has a bit of a legitimacy problem, because just like Catholics and Mormons don't see eye to eye on religious issues, the Sunni and Shia Muslims have been fighting about doctrinal, theological, the finer points of these things for a very long time. And they're often settled through violence, or maybe we should say litigated through violence. And so one of the ways that Iran has tried to achieve legitimacy with its Sunni neighbors in the Middle East is by going after Israel. Now, there's no question that the Islamic ideology of the Ayatollah regime is very serious in its intent to destroy Israel. It's also true that Iran is trying to be the big hegemonic power in the Middle East. They want to be like the big guy in the neighborhood. And they're also trying to gain legitimacy with their Sunni neighbors. So for all of these reasons, they have been hell-bent on destroying Israel for the last 50 years. Now, they're not really interested in sacrificing Persian lives to do this and sacrificing Iranian lives to do this. So what they do is they arm their proxies in the region who are Arab, not necessarily Shiite, right? The Hezbollah is Shia, but most of the other ones are Sunni. And they are willing, Iran is willing to fight to the last Arab to destroy Israel, right? So it takes nothing from Iran until I think probably the next week, in which Iran is going to pay an exceedingly high price from Israel. But up until this point, Iran has paid virtually no price except for the massive amounts of money that they've been funneling to these proxies. And one of those proxies is Hezbollah up on the northern border. And for the last 20 years, since Israel withdrew from its occupation of southern Lebanon, Iran has been building up Hezbollah immediately to Israel's northern border. And we're talking like this is so close that if you were to stand, in the Salt Lake Valley, if you were to stand on this side in South Jordan, you can look across the Salt Lake Valley and see Hezbollah outposts. They're closer than that. They're right next to the Israeli border, and they have dug tunnels under the Israeli border, and they have been preparing for an October 7th style attack for a long time. And while it's not possible to know exactly how well these guys are armed, the estimates are between 150 and 200,000 missiles. Rockets and missiles, right? Rockets are unguided, missiles are guided. They've got plenty of both pointed at Israel. And that serves two purposes. One, the explicit goal to try to destroy Israel, right? And the other is to act as a deterrent from Israel directly striking Iran, because Iran is really, none of these groups love Israel, but Iran is really they're making all of this happen.
They're funding melee.
They're funding it. They're training it.
But they're not fighting in it necessarily.
But they're not fighting it.
So they're funding. They're sending their minions out to get Israel.
Exactly.
Huh.
So the war with Hezbollah is still ongoing.
Now, excuse me. Is Hezbollah like Hamas in that it's just a military force, or do they have like political power over there?
Yeah.
They
hold about half the seats in parliament.
Oh, okay.
In Lebanon. Yeah. Lebanon Hezbollah has effectively destroyed Lebanon. Now you'll hear people say, "Oh, well, they offer civil services and they help with education." It's like, yeah, kind of, but like there was a cholera outbreak in Lebanon last year. Like in 2023, Lebanon's dealing with cholera because the water maintenance systems are so underdeveloped. They have rolling blackouts because the electricity grid is so poorly managed, right? So it's not like Hezbollah is coming in and like they're not Lebanon's salvation. And Hezbollah's Lebanon has had no president for the last 2 years because under Lebanese law, the president has to be Christian. Remember, Lebanon is made up of a whole bunch of different ethnic and religious groups. And there's no potential Christian president that Hezbollah approves of. So there just hasn't been a president. I don't know if you remember, like a couple of years ago, there was that huge explosion in the Lebanese port and a couple hundred people died. And it was because Hezbollah was storing fertilizer, essentially, that they were using to make explosives, and they weren't taking good care of it, and it fucking blew up and destroyed the port in Beirut. So, yes, Hezbollah is similar to Hamas in the sense that they are a political organization. They're a military organization, but Hezbollah is much scarier because there's more of them. They're far better trained. They spent the last, 15 years helping Bashar al-Assad kill his people in the civil war in Syria, including Palestinians, by the way. And they're just a much more they've got precision weapons, they've got commando forces, they've got the Radwan force, which is their like elite commando unit, and they're a really formidable enemy, right? And Israel has actually been preparing for the war in Lebanon for the last 20 years, just as Hezbollah has been preparing for war with Israel for the last 20 years. Everybody knew it was going to happen. It was a question of when. October 8th. Hezbollah starts shooting rockets into Israel. And it sort of was like a low level of, everybody was trading missiles and rockets and anti-tank munitions back and forth for about the last year. And then finally, something happened a couple of weeks ago, which was this Israeli pager operation. And Israel had infiltrated Hezbollah. Now, you have to remember that there's a huge portion of the Lebanese that hate Hezbollah and would like to see it gone. So I don't think it's very hard for Israel to get intelligence assets in Lebanon. And they infiltrated Hezbollah to the point that they made it clear that they were intercepting the Hezbollah communications on their cell phones, and what they needed to move to was pagers. And Israel actually injected themselves into the supply chain to the point where they sold the pagers to Hezbollah, and these pagers were full of a tiny amount of explosives. Okay. And I don't think Israel actually meant to use this a couple of weeks ago. I think they were going to wait. But a couple of guys kind of figured out what was going on. And it became either use it now or lose this fucking insane capability altogether. And they used it. And they blew the hands off of thousands of Hezbollah operatives. Okay. It's like the most unbelievably precise operation in military history. It's unreal. And its sophistication and complicated. I mean, just unbelievable. Okay. So at this point, Israel's got such a tactical advantage that I don't necessarily think they were, just from what I understand, they weren't going to shift their entire focus to the northern border, but they had to press this advantage, and now they have. And within the matter of about 3 weeks, they've destroyed at least half of Hezbollah's missile arsenal. People call it an assassination. It's not an assassination. These groups are at war, right? Assassination implies like an element of illegitimacy to it. They killed all of Hezbollah's top leadership. And now they've pushed them back far enough that Israel has actually crossed the border into Lebanon and is in the process of destroying this super sophisticated network of tunnels and all the houses that Hezbollah built. I mean, you have to like see this stuff to believe it, where there's rooms in these houses that were built to hold these massive fucking missiles. And they're hidden there because they're in homes, right? And this is supposed to be a deterrent because if you attack those homes, it causes a lot of civilian, whatever. Most people have evacuated at this point, and Israel is in there dismantling it right now. And Israeli troops are dying every day, and this is not getting quite as much coverage. And in the meantime, Israel's just bombing the shit out of all the Hezbollah sites throughout Lebanon, including in Beirut. And they're hitting supplies, the supply chain, like the Iran to Hezbollah supply chain all through Syria. There was, before the pager operation, there was this, again, this absolutely phenomenal secret operation of this weapons lab that in Syria that in the past has developed not only chemical weapons, but precision-guided munitions. And this Israeli commando force helicoptered in, hit the ground, killed everybody, stole a bunch of documents, blew the place up, and got out of there, and nobody died. So this is what they've been doing for the last, 4 weeks. And Hezbollah is now asking for a ceasefire. And both Israel and the United States are saying absolutely not. It's too late for that. No, a ceasefire will come, but it's not going to come until Israel has said, essentially, you have been pushed so far back from the border, and we have destroyed your capabilities around the border that you are no longer a threat. The 70,000 Israelis that have been displaced from their homes on the northern border, and these villages have been completely destroyed, can now go home and begin rebuilding. And then you have the issue of Iran, and Israel's in the process of taking care of that right now. Now, last week, Iran sent in this massive barrage of about 200 ballistic missiles. It was much more effective than their last attack, but it gave Israel the legitimacy it needed to hit Iran at home, which is what they're about to do. Knowing the Israelis and knowing their objectives, which is to prevent Iran from sort of prolonging a war of attrition and to just keep this going and going and going, Israel's really going to fuck them up. I don't know what they're going to do. I think we're going to find out pretty soon. But once that happens, this could potentially get much worse before it gets better, then it will stop. And it's going to stop on all fronts. It's not going to be completely over. There's always going to be some counterinsurgency in the West Bank and Gaza and probably in Lebanon, but then it's going to stop.
So when you say it's going to stop, you mean the stuff that was started about a year ago is going to stop?
Right. And there's not going to be, Hamas is no longer going to be, I mean, you got to go down to southern Israel sometime. And I think everybody needs to do this. You go down to southern Israel, and there's this town called Sderot. And in Sderot, which is next to the Gaza Strip, you go to a children's playground, and in every single playground, there's equipment that doubles as a fucking bomb shelter. Okay? So it's like, and it'll be painted really pretty, but it'll be like a tube, and it's shaped like a caterpillar, and it's painted green and yellow. Okay? But that's where the kids hide. Because over the last 20 years, if the rockets have come in from Gaza, you've got about 30 seconds before they land. There's bomb shelters constructed by the roadside so you can get out of your car and run into them. Okay? That's going to stop. And it's never going to happen again. And it's not going to happen again on the northern border. Israel's never going to allow this kind of militant buildup because the cost on October 7th was so high.
Yeah. And on that, so you and your kids came over about a week after that happened. Had you maybe planned on that? Like with all the strife that goes on over there, did you and your husband just say, hey, if something ever happens, let's plan on you coming over to the U.S., take the kids? Or is this kind of like a spur of the moment decision that you guys made?
It's a little bit of both.
Both.
Our agreement when we got engaged was we would always live in Israel. We'd spend summers in the U.S., but we would live in Israel. If it ever looked like there was going to be an existential war, I would take the kids and go to the U.S. If Woody could come, great. He worked for the police, so he can't, so he stayed there. So we knew that if it got to that point that we would do it. We just didn't know that it was going to get to that point.
So he's still there. I'm sure you're in contact with him daily.
Every day. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. How stressful is that for both of you?
My husband's Israeli. These people are so tough. I can't even tell you, like, to the extent where sometimes I want to be like, do you know how serious this is? And he does, because he's a pretty serious guy. But there's plenty of Israelis. I mean, like, you see these videos from when rockets are flying into Israel and people are outside filming it. There's just a level of, like, you can't live your whole life under that level of fear all the time, right?
Well, and if you've grown up with it, and if your ancestors for 2,000 years have grown up with it.
Right.
I just can't even imagine.
I mean, you have to, like, my husband remembers during the Gulf War, hiding, like, sleeping, the whole family, there's 4 kids in his family, sleeping with his parents in their bed with the military issue gas masks because they were afraid Saddam Hussein was going to use chemical weapons. I mean, these people have just been through it and then some, right? So for him, I mean, it's like, on the Tuesday that Iran sent in all of these missiles, so last week, right as that was happening, there was a really, really ugly terror attack on the light rail, and a bunch of people died, including a young mother my age who was carrying her child, who lived, thank God, but she was shot and killed. Okay, and I'm watching this happening, and I can see the footage, and the missiles are coming in, and I, like, am having a hard time breathing. And he's, like, in the shelter. He's like, honey, it's going to be fine. Like, I'll call you every 20 minutes or so, because he doesn't want to drain his battery, because if the power gets knocked out, who knows when it'll come back on again. But he's pretty cool about it.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So I think it's scarier for me than it is for him.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh, and your kids are too young to know any of this
Thank
stuff.
God.
They're about a year and a half.
Thank God. Yeah. They're a year and a half now.
Gosh.
Yeah. Yeah. I have friends trying to explain this to their kids, and it's terrible.
How do you feel about, you mentioned a little while ago about the U.S. and the West. How are we handling it with you, right? I mean, it sounds like there's, and I know you said earlier that there will never be peace, and kick the Brits out because they just were getting in the way. Mm-hmm. Like, how about the U.S.? Like, are we getting in the way, or are we helpful, or what's your take on that, or what's Israel's take on that?
This is kind of a tricky question because, again, like, the old saying, like, you ask 2 Jews a question, you get 3 different answers. So it totally depends on who you ask, but I'll share my perspective. On the one hand, the United States has been unbelievably supportive, right? Where they're sending in the munitions that Israel needs for the most part. They keep saying that they support Israel's right to defend itself. They veto the kind of bullshit anti-Israel UN resolutions that call for it, that are completely meaningless. On the other hand, I have a really hard time understanding the sort of continuous Obama, Biden, Harris foreign policy approach. I don't really understand why there was as much appeasement of Iran as there has been. I thought the nuclear deal was a disaster because even though it stopped, well, it slowed down Iranian nuclear proliferation. It didn't do anything about the proxies in the region, and it unleashed billions of dollars to Iran, which of course then it used. I mean, the Obama administration was like, oh, it'll go towards medicine. Well, okay, money's fungible. You can use it for anything you want. And they knew that this was going to go into helping fuel these proxies, which is exactly what it did. And now you see these statements, these sort of mealy-mouthed statements from the Biden-Harris administration where they'll say, well, we support Israel's right to defend itself, but there's way too many Palestinians dying in Gaza, and we don't want to see Israel go into Rafah. you had the sort of famous Kamala Harris, like, I've looked at those maps. Those folks have nowhere to go. And then 2 months later, Israel goes into Rafah and they safely evacuated all the people that it was like 2 million people. Okay. So on the one, it wasn't 2 million, it was like 1.2 million. So on the one hand, and at the same time, there's certain munitions and certain equipment that they are not giving to Israel. And they're not formally not giving it. They're just sort of slow tracking it, right? So like the end result is that Israel's not getting it. It's intentional on the Biden-Harris administration's part. And you keep seeing things like a call for a ceasefire and including with Hezbollah. Like we don't want to see an escalation. And when you live in the Middle East, you begin to understand very quickly that if you say, I don't want to fight, I don't want to fight, I don't want to fight, you make yourself very vulnerable, right? And so the United States has been saying to Iran and its proxies, I don't want to fight, and I don't want Israel to fight either. So we don't really want to help make this happen.
So that's not helping you guys.
But it's not helping, right? The Israel and the United States, at least for now, should be standing shoulder to shoulder and saying Iran is a danger to the region, it's a danger to international interests, it's a danger to peace, and Israel might not be doing this exactly the way that we do it, but they're solving a lot of problems for a lot of people right now.
I don't know if we should get into this, but what if there was a new administration and they didn't want anything to do with that entire region? Israel, Iran, Libya, Lebanon, none of that. And they don't talk about it. They don't send munitions. What would happen? Because I've heard, and again, I believe about 2% of what I hear. Mm-hmm. I've heard that, if it weren't for the United States, Israel would get crushed in a day. Like, is there maybe some truth to that, or is that just dramatic talk? I mean, I don't know.
Some of it is true for sure. I mean, I think we're going to find out over the next couple decades because the United States is becoming more and more isolationist. It doesn't need the Middle East anymore. The United States is now a net exporter of energy. So because of the fracking revolution, we now have access to all the energy that we need. And increasingly, we're doing more business with South America and Central America in terms of energy needs than we are with the Middle East. Now, I don't think the United States can ever completely get out of the Middle East because it's such a strategic point of the world. I don't think anybody ever can. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Like right now, an Iranian proxy that we haven't even talked about yet, there's a whole other one called the Houthis, and they're down in Yemen. And if you look at a map, there's a very, very skinny section of land between Yemen and I believe it's Ethiopia, and then, the point is, there's a very, very small portion of water that then opens up into the Red Sea and comes up to the top, and here's Egypt and the Suez Canal, and here's Israel. Something like 15% of the world's container traffic passes through there on its way to Europe. Okay. So because the Houthis, in what they say is their support of Palestine, they've been attacking indiscriminately merchant vessels in the Red Sea. And the United States, over the last, since World War II, has played a very important role around the entire world to help facilitate safe international shipping. I mean, like, piracy is virtually unheard of now. It's beginning to make a comeback, but I mean, you look at a cargo ship, and they're just massive floating. There's no security on cargo ships at all because it's been so safe for the last 50 or 60 years. Okay, that's starting to change. And the Houthis are spearheading that change. And when container ships can't go past the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and up into the Red Sea, they have to go down and around the Horn of Africa. And it's far more expensive. It takes about a month longer, and it costs about $1 million more per container ship. Everybody's impacted by that. Everybody is impacted by that. Not only America, but America's allies. And that's why the United States and Britain have been bombing the Houthis for the last year or so. They're not doing a particularly effective job of it because the Houthis just blew up a British oil container like a week and a half ago. But the point is that the U.S. is starting to pull out of the region. And even if it sinks, like, I don't think it's ever going to be able to get out completely. But they were so willing to get out that we had this disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And they've now struck a deal with the government in Iraq that after next year, there aren't going to be U.S. Army bases in Iraq anymore, right? So they're leaving. And Israel is so small that it just can't, it doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the manpower. It cannot become, it can't industrialize at a scale that it can produce its own munitions.
Well, especially if you got half a dozen groups in the region that just keep
Exactly.
throwing missiles at it.
Exactly.
I mean, it's like Israel and then everybody else.
Right.
Kind of.
So, you'll see that I think America is going to provide less and less of this, no matter who's in power.
But you mentioned Britain support. When I say support, I mean either give money or give resources to.
They're doing both to Israel. So is Germany. So France.
Okay. So there's a lot of countries besides these.
Oh, yeah. And you have to understand, too, that these countries aren't doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. Like, okay, Germany maybe because they have some guilt. This is part of their national,
I've heard that,
ethic.
yeah.
Okay, but Israel provides these countries an amazing amount of benefit in exchange for this, right? So, like, just for the United States. It is one thing to develop the world's most sophisticated weaponry. It's a completely other thing to know whether or not it's going to work in real time. And so they give Israel all this money, and a huge portion of it goes right back to the military-industrial complex where Israel is able to purchase the most sophisticated U.S. not the most, but pretty close to the most sophisticated U.S. military equipment. And then the U.S. gets to see, how does this perform in real time? Like, this is invaluable information, especially for the United States, because it hasn't really fought a war.
So we're not setting off bombs in Nevada anymore. We're sending them over to Israel and letting them
we're doing
test it
both.
out.
First, we test it there, and then once we know it works, we sell it to Israel. But that real-time information is really, really important. That's a big part of it. And then it's also just the intelligence. Like Israel's intelligence is unparalleled around the entire world, and they are constantly helping the United States and Great Britain and France and Sweden and Germany. They're foiling plots, Hamas plots, Hezbollah plots, all over the world, all the time. So that's really important. And also, I think these countries know that as things are getting more and more dangerous, I mean, German Jews and French Jews and British Jews are increasingly moving to Israel. And it's a safe place for them to go because these governments are finding that they're having a harder and harder time protecting Jews from these countries. So Israel is not, geopolitics doesn't work in like, I'm helping you out of the goodness of my heart, right? They're getting something in return, and there's definitely some ideological compatibility between Israel and these countries, but yeah, I mean, they see eye to eye on a lot of important things.
And so when we don't hear it so much anymore, but I remember, 10 years ago and beyond, we need to protect our interests overseas. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what they're talking about, is protecting this place where the ships are going through and it costs an extra $1 million per freighter going around. Okay, so that's
a big part of it, but it's also the oil. Okay, part of what people are really worried about right now, including the United States, and they're publicly saying this, is that Israel's going to go after Karg Island, which is the Iranian oil processing facilities, and they're super vulnerable. Israel could take these guys out in an hour, okay? And they would decimate the Iranian economy. Part of the reason that everybody's so afraid that they're going to do that is because Iran has threatened in return to attack the oil production facilities in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Oman and all the other places that are. So, and all the time people are like I had a guy say to me just the other day, he's like, this whole fight is about fucking oil. It's so corrupt. I'm like, do you drive to work? Do you enjoy not freezing to death in the winter? Like, oil really matters. And it's bad for the environment, and perhaps one day we'll
Is it though? That's what they say.
I don't know enough about it to even.
I don't either.
Except to say that it's really important.
Oh, of course it's important.
Right. So the United States has an interest, even if we don't need that oil, our allies do. And I think it's in the U.S.'s interest for world stability for that not to happen. Yeah.
Okay. During our pre-interview, you had mentioned Bibi. Now, who or what is Bibi?
So Bibi is Benjamin Netanyahu. His Hebrew name is Binyamin, which is where the Bibi comes from. And he has been the prime minister of Israel for most of the last 20 years. He's an incredibly savvy politician. And he's similar to Donald Trump in the sense that he tends to generate highly polarized opinions. People either kind of love him or they hate him.
Now, this is within Israel or around the world?
All
or both?
Around the world, both.
Okay.
Both. So outside of Israel, there's this really interesting perception of Bibi as a warmonger. And I had a guy tell me this the other day. I went in and sat down at a bar that I used to work at in northern Utah back in college. And the bartender, who's been there for forever, is just a wonderful, wonderful guy. And we were talking, and he said something to the effect of, man, it's such a shame that your prime minister is more interested in waging war than finding a solution to the problem. And I was like, tell me more about that. Where did you hear that from? Like, what is that?
This is where I love when outside countries like to tell countries what they're doing right and doing wrong.
Oh, completely. And I was also just really curious sort of what his perception was. And I think that is not an unusual view, which is interesting for a number of reasons. Netanyahu is one of the most risk-averse politicians. He's good, but he's incredibly risk-averse. And in retrospect, it's very easy to criticize Netanyahu's approach to Hamas in Gaza, which was basically to say, we are going to increase the number of work permits of Gazans coming into Israel to work by many tens of thousands. We're going to keep allowing funding. We're going to sort of turn a blind eye to the billions of dollars that you're getting from Qatar and American dollars. And we're going to kind of ignore your bellicose rhetoric, thinking that, like, if we allow things to gradually open up and life gets better for the Palestinians in Gaza, that what you are going to want is to keep that up. Okay, in retrospect, that's very clearly Hamas did not want that. The same thing with Hezbollah, where perhaps Israel lacked the international legitimacy to go in and fight in Lebanon at any point over the last 20 years, but in choosing not to go in and fight, they allowed Israel to become encircled by enemies that are armed to the fucking teeth. And that was on Netanyahu's watch. And this guy bills himself, he's like Mr. Security, right? Now, there's certain things that he's really, really right about. For the last 20 years, he's been pointing the finger at Iran and saying, they're the problem. They're really the ones that we really need to go after. And he's been right about that, like that Iran should never be allowed to go nuclear. And if it means striking them directly on their own soil, that's what we need to do. But although he would go into Gaza and carry out this is a very coarse term, but everybody knows what you mean when you say it, these mowing the lawn operations where you would just sort of manage the militancy, but you're not going in and destroying it. Now, I think it's probably fair to say that Netanyahu and the entire political security, intelligence, and military apparatus completely underestimated what Hamas was capable of doing. I mean, there were really serious warning signs that October 7th was going to happen, and they were dismissed out of hand because it was like, no way. There's no way they're going to try that. What they're really looking for is like better lives for their people. And okay. So Netanyahu was totally wrong about that. And he didn't fight the fights that he probably should have fought 15, 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Okay. So he also is an interesting guy because he's facing several charges of corruption. Now, I personally don't get really involved emotionally in political leaders, whether it's Netanyahu or whether it's Trump. It's very, or Biden, or I don't care. It's very easy for me to say, here's the policies that I think are working well. Here's parts of their character that I don't love. I've never been on like the fuck Trump bandwagon or like I'm not part of MAGA. Same thing with Netanyahu. So I think I'm like being fairly balanced when I say that I feel that the criminal charges or the criminal indictments of Netanyahu are not very robust.
Now, where are those coming from? The UN or from?
No. These are all internal.
Really?
Yeah. And they're not.
That's the polarizing part you were talking about.
That's part of it for sure. But I think, again, this is my personal opinion. So many of these charges and the way that they've been prosecuted are actually a product of the polarization and not just a cause of it. For sure, they've helped fuel it. But the case has been playing out. The cases have been playing out for many, many years, and there's been all kinds of corruption and terrible behavior on the part of the prosecutors, and they've had to throw out evidence, and witnesses have stepped down because they admitted that they lied or whatever. Okay, these are not. The argument is basically that Bibi is prolonging the war because he is afraid that he's going to go to jail if he's not prime minister anymore. And it's not like he doesn't get immunity like the president of the United States does. Like these prosecutions are ongoing throughout this war. So it's a stupid argument, I think, for a number of reasons. Maybe not even stupid. It's false. But I just don't think these charges are very strong anyway. But you see people saying that a lot. He's a warmonger, and he is continuing to prosecute the war because of how he's doing it, like because he's trying to avoid the commission of inquiry that's going to come afterwards, and the fact that he's going to be raked over the coals, which he is. There's not going to be any way for him to avoid that unless, he dies between now and tomorrow. But like this is a guy who really cares about his legacy, right? So he's a savvy politician, and he's for sure trying to redeem himself now by prosecuting the war in a competent fashion, which I actually think he is. But I also think that if Bibi died tomorrow or the coalition collapsed, anybody who's going to replace him is going to do this exactly the same way. So I don't know. I think like most, there's a lot of misconceptions about what's happening internally in Israel. And again, I don't think Bibi's a great guy. I don't think he's a terrible guy. I think there's certain things he's really good at, certain things he's not good at.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the world perception of the conflict? Like, what are people getting right, and especially in the news? So what are people getting right, and what are people getting wrong?
I don't think you can really answer that question without thinking a little bit about sort of the social and cultural attitude of the West right now. And we live in a time where strength is viewed with suspicion, and victims are viewed with with a sort of aggressive compassion, right? So the Palestinians are very much viewed through the lens of, I would say sort of two things that really affect us. The first is, if you're a victim, that must mean you're right. And the second is, they must be doing this because the only thing that would make me do this is oppression. And so obviously what's happening here is that Israel is the big bad oppressor. The Palestinians are the victims, and that's the end of it. That's really as sophisticated as a lot of this conversation goes.
That really baffles me too, because growing up, I always had the impression it was the opposite, that Israel was this peaceful little country. They're just trying to live their lives, and they just keep getting bombed and attacked and sneak attacked, and kids are getting killed. And it's just so weird. And now, I mean, the perception is weird, not what's going on. But in the last year, it's like free Palestine, free Palestine. I'm like, where did this come from? Like, I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
But you could be right about the West's view of victimhood being the ones who's always right.
I think it's always been there, especially among sort of the more elite, educated circles.
I'd never heard it until now, so it must be more.
Well, it hasn't been. It has
must be more in the media now than it used to be, or at least I never picked up on it.
I think that's true. I also think that the death toll in Gaza, and I mean this is the most filmed war in history, and the Palestinians, by and large, are pretty incompetent. And I don't say that as like a cultural aspersion. I mean, there's not very many things that they're good at. They don't export anything besides terror and really excellent footage of every time Israel attacks. Okay. So much of the Palestinian strategy is saying, oh my God, look how horrible what's happening here, and showing it in just the most explicit detail. And it is. Okay. I mean, I have friends who disagree with me on this. I have a lot of compassion for a mother whose son is my kid's age and has been killed in Gaza. It really, really bothers me. And to see that, and to know it's happening, and to know that your ally is the one making it happen, I think is a very painful thing for young Americans who have never seen war before. Okay, now, 40,000 Palestinians-ish, about 42,000 now, have died in the last year. The accusation that Israel is committing genocide is, in my opinion, patently absurd. Like, Israel could have, without losing a single soldier, could have killed everybody in the Gaza Strip in about a week and a half. Okay? And they're not. And it's not just because they're afraid of international opprobrium, because they're getting plenty of that anyway, and they're not changing their strategy. Something like, probably we don't know for sure, my guess from the statistics that I've seen from impartial observers, at least 30, probably closer to 40% of the casualties in the Gaza Strip have been militants. Now, they are not going to release that information. And when they release information, they do not distinguish between civilians and fighters. That's on purpose, right? That's a pretty fucked up thing to do. And they do it on purpose because what you will see is people saying 42,000 civilians, 42,000 civilians. It's not true, but it's a very sticky line, right? So there's that. I think war is always to be avoided at all costs if you know what it looks like. And it always looks like that. I mean, I think the first day of D-Day, when the United States went into Normandy, 40,000 French civilians died, like in the first 3 days or something like that. And they weren't trying to hit civilians, right? I mean, like, war is that bad. And I think the IDF is not perfect, but it's doing the best it can given the circumstances to protect Palestinian civilians. Now, the UN and the different sort of appendages of the UN, including the Human Rights Watch, are essentially at this point, it's very hard for me to take them seriously because, first of all, the world is, they're made up of the nations of the world, and the nations of the world are not all good actors, right? And a huge portion of the nations of the world are Arab nations. There's something like there's about 70 Arab nations. And they don't take a favorable approach to Israel, and a lot of them are voting in the UN. And then you have things like the UN Rights Watch and Iran, and I'm not kidding. Everything I'm saying, you should Google. I'm not making this up. Iran was going to be on the head of the Women's Commission of the UN Human Rights Watch. Okay, and there was a huge outcry in large part because of a guy named Hillel Rosen, who is the head of UN Rights Watch, who's a watchdog group of the UN rights groups. And he brought so much attention to the fact that Iran was going to be the head of the Women's Commission that everybody was like, okay, fine, we won't put Iran in charge, where they kill young women for not wearing their hijab correctly. I'm sorry, it's not Hillel Rosen who heads UN Rights Watch. It's Hillel. Okay, you can look him up. His name's Hillel. I can't remember his last name. So it's very hard for me to take what the UN says seriously. And you see these reports come out and these resolutions come out. Okay, and I'll give you an example. Without even looking at the content of the resolutions, there's something like the ratio of resolutions that condemn Israel compared to the rest of the world combined is like 18-1 every year, okay? And that's not because Israel's the worst country in the whole fucking world. Like, give me
Because there's a lot of representation against them in the UN.
completely.
See, that just doesn't seem fair.
It's a political body.
Yeah.
It's not fair. It's not fair, but it has never been fair.
Of course.
So
Sure.
it's very hard for me to take the UN and international bodies seriously when you have actors, just to name a few, like China, for example. And you want to talk about genocide, you want to talk colonialism, you want to talk concentration camps and open air prisons. Nobody on college campuses, nobody in the UN, nobody's saying anything about China. Okay, so I don't want to fucking hear it. It's horseshit. It honestly is, and it's not done in good faith. It's done in a bigoted way to attack Israel. And again, Israel's not a perfect country. I think there's plenty of things that Israel does that it shouldn't be doing. But I mean, come on. Just look it up. Just look it up. Look up UN resolutions against Israel, and North Korea gets like one every year. So.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the UN. I'm not a fan of a lot of politics in general.
Yeah.
You mentioned Israel could be doing certain things better. What are your thoughts?
Well, its PR sucks to begin with, right? They just. I think among Jews in general. Look, now I was raised Mormon and I converted to Judaism, so I think I have sort of an interesting and unique perspective about this. And what I see a lot from Jews, including Israel, is this: like, they're going to hate us no matter what we do. It doesn't matter how we do it or what we do, so fuck it. We're not even going to bother trying to have the conversation. I think that's a huge mistake, which is part of the reason that I try to talk so much about it. So that's a big part of it. I also think part of it is that they've got 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds in the IDF running their social media accounts, and they shouldn't be doing that. This is a serious war. It's a serious situation, and it needs to be treated seriously. And what you see coming out of their social media accounts a lot of the time is exactly what you would expect to see if you saw young people running it. I mean, their PR is just, it's goofy at best. Okay, but that's sort of the more superficial stuff. In terms of the more serious things that I think Israel could be doing, I think it's pretty easy for me to go toe to toe with anybody about just about anything in Israel except for the settlements, and not all of the settlements, but some of the settlements. The criticism of the settlements is that it is pretty clearly an effort by Israel to settle parts of the land that Palestinians would have for their own nation. I don't actually think that's completely true, but neither is it completely false. First of all, I don't think Palestinians want their own nation right now, so long as there's a Jewish state. And over the years, Israel has offered the Palestinians so much, including in 2000, Ehud Olmert offered the Palestinians like 97% of the West Bank. And then there's the settlements that were there at the time, which are very close to Jerusalem and the Green Line, which is sort of the demarcation between the West Bank and Israel, make up about 2 to 4%. It's not a huge percentage of the landmass, and it's fairly close to Israel. And then there's these like smaller outposts that would not be hard to remove people from. Those people would fight, but we did it in Gaza. We could do it again in the West Bank. However, I think this war is fundamentally between two groups of people who both feel like they have legitimate claims to the entire area. Mm-hmm. One of those groups has been willing to compromise over and over and over again, and one other group has not only not said yes, but it's refused to even negotiate. So I think what Israel's doing in terms of the settlements is basically they're saying, well, fuck it. Like, if you're not going to come to the table, we have what we want, and you guys are sore losers. And I'm sorry, like, I don't necessarily believe that might is right, but that's the way that the world works, whether you like it or not. And you can't lose war after war after war and then think that you get to make demands of the victors in perpetuity. It doesn't work like that. So as long as the Palestinians show that they are really seriously not interested, I think the settlements are going to continue to expand. I think they're going to continue to be condemned, both internationally and there's the thing you have to understand about Israel is an extremely rigorous internal conversation about everything. You've got peace activists, and you've got anti-settlement, and you've got anti-occupation. You've got everything. So the occupation and the settlements are going to continue to be condemned. But I think they're probably going to continue to keep growing because the Palestinians aren't offering an alternative. And I don't think there's one single country in the entire world, including the United States, that would say, well, we're just going to let that land sit there until you decide that you want to play nice. So I understand the condemnation. I also think there's a really serious argument to be made that until things really seriously change, the existence of a Palestinian state right next to the Israeli one in the West Bank, you would get exactly what you see in Gaza. And Israel is not going to let that happen. It's not going to let it happen both because, well, for a few reasons. I mean, if you look at a map of Israel, the West Bank, you've got the Mediterranean Sea and Israel, and then the West Bank. And the West Bank is kind of a B shape. So if you're looking at Israel, Mediterranean, Israel, the West Bank, I said, look like this. The West Bank kind of comes out and then it goes back in, and then it comes back out and it goes back in. And then you've got the Dead Sea running along the very easternmost side and the Jordan River. There are points in not far from where I live where that sort of protrusion of the sort of B shape of the West Bank, the distance between there and the sea is single-digit miles, okay? And so if you have a belligerent, well-armed army in the West Bank, it is a very easy tactical maneuver to cut Israel in half. And Israel's not going to fucking let that happen. No way. It would be a disaster. The other thing that you have to know about the West Bank is that it's higher than the rest of Israel, right? So if I stand I live in a high-rise building and I'm on the 10th floor and I face northeast. So standing on my porch, I can see the hills of Judea and Samaria, right? Again, these places are very, very close, and they're much higher than we are. I mean, Jerusalem's like a city on a hill, and then you've got this sort of mountain. It's not a mountain. We wouldn't consider it a mountain, but, these hills that run north-south. And if you have a militant group, it's so easy for them to fire rockets down into Israel. Very, very easy. And Israel, again, is not going to let that happen. So until there's a serious, enthusiastic, meaningful move towards peace from the Palestinians writ large, like a significant body of the Palestinians, and the Palestinian leadership demanding peace is willing to restrain with violence the jihadi anti-Israel elements, the occupation is going to continue and the settlements are going to continue growing. I'm not saying it's pretty. That is the way the world works. And people who really want to advocate for the Palestinian cause should be pushing the Palestinians to make peace, because that's the only solution.
Is that what's going to end this 2,000-year conflict? I mean, like you said, it seems like Israel's been making a lot of concessions and trying to make it work just over the decades. And nobody else seems to want to come to the table, one, or two, make concessions. So is that what's really going to end this whole thing, is both sides are actually going to have to come to the table and...
Yes, unless Israel truly commits genocide, which it's not going to do.
That's what I was just going to say. Yeah. The alternative is just to bomb the other country and off the map.
Right. Or push them into Jordan and Egypt.
Yeah.
And neither of those countries want that. And the Palestinians don't want that. I mean, so there's a woman named Einat Wilf, who she's Israeli and she speaks impeccable English, and she was a member of she was a member of the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, in the labor. She was a member of the Labor Party. The Labor Party is very far left. Like, Labor parties are all over the world, right? So Einat Wilf is not a conservative by any stretch of the imagination, but she wrote a really good book called The War of Return. Everybody should read it. And what she talks about in this book is she has a very direct approach to addressing the way that the Palestinians are thinking about this issue, which is genuinely, sooner or later, probably sooner, but we're willing to wait if it's later, Israel's not going to exist anymore. And that's partly because we're going to be fighting, and that's partly because Allah wills it, and that's partly because the other Arab nations are going to help us in the uprising. And when Israel stops existing, we're going to go home. This is called the right of return in the Palestinian narrative. Now, under international law and throughout human history, there's no such thing as a right of return. You know, during the Palestinians call the 1948 war, when about 700,000 of them got pushed out of the land, they call it the Nakba, which means catastrophe. Years after that, but in the next 10 years, the equivalent number or more, about 800,000 to 1 million Jews, were pushed out of their homes in the Middle East, into Israel, mostly, and some into Canada and some into the United States. Nobody's calling for their right of return, okay? After World War II, something like, I'm not going to give you a number because I can't be 100% sure that I can get the exact number right, but many millions of Germans, ethnic Germans, were pushed out of the countries surrounding Germany into Germany. They were ethnically cleansed from the surrounding countries post-World War II. World War II saw some of the biggest, and the years after saw some of the biggest population transfers that the world has ever seen. Nobody is calling for the right of return except the Palestinians. They are the one group that still thinks that they're going to go back to where they were in 1940, and it's not going to happen. And as long as the world, and this is what Einat Wilf's book is all about, as long as the world continues to feed the Palestinian narrative of you have the right of return, you will go back home one day, the conflict is never going to end. So the rest of them has some responsibility in this too.
Yeah, that makes sense. And especially because they're fighting anyway, and then they get the support elsewhere.
Right.
It's,
Right. And the culture has become far more jihadi than it used to be. And dying for the cause is a virtue.
Now, jihadi, as I understand it, is you're fighting because God said so.
Yes, and you're willing to use spectacular violence. Mm-hmm. Yes. And
And if you die in the process, it doesn't matter.
all the better, because then you get a straight shot to the afterlife,
Right.
and your virgins and paradise and the whole works. Yes, yes, yes. And it's people talk about like Hamas and Hezbollah as if they're death cults, and they are. I mean, they worship death. And I mean, there was just this. It's incredible because people in the West don't want to believe it, and they say it explicitly all the time. There was a journalist in Lebanon that was just speaking in English. Israel kills Hassan Nasrallah, who's the head of Hezbollah. And this woman is doing a TV interview, and she's crying, and she's saying, I wish that God gave us back Nasrallah and took my kids. But he's gone. And so my kids are now going to be the martyrs, and we will raise our sons to fight and die for the cause, right? But this is so endemic. And they're very proud of it. And it is us in the West who say, well, surely not, because we think everybody wants the same thing at the end of the day, and that we all sort of agree that we want good lives for our kids, and we don't. And it's really important to understand that we do not share these bedrock foundational values.
That was going to be one of my questions. Actually, is there anything else you want to talk about the conflict? I know we took a lot of notes. We could pause and check them real quick.
No, I think it's okay. I mean, I
we
think
okay?
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you then, kind of taking this out of the shadows, like where can we go from here?
Look, I mean, especially in terms of geopolitics, nothing is stable and nothing lasts forever. If I had to predict what I think is going to happen over the next 10 or 20 years, I think all of the Arab nations around Israel are watching what Israel is doing very, very closely right now. And all of these nations are threatened by Iran. So as of right now, Israel shares interests. Like, there's no allies, there's only temporary interests, right? Israel shares interests temporarily with a lot of these Arab countries, and they know that. And so they actually, despite the fact that many of their population is still not only virulently anti-Semitic, but extremely anti-Israel, the leaders of these countries are willing to say, for our own good, we're willing to make peace with you. So this is where something like the Abraham Accords comes in, which happened during Trump's presidency. And for many decades, the idea was that the obstacle to peace in the Middle East was the Palestinian issue. And Donald Trump, especially his son Jared Kushner, came in and started thinking about it a little bit differently. And they said, look, this is not a situation that's going to be resolved. So we're going to put it aside, and we're going to help Israel pursue peace with its other Arab neighbors. And what they found was that there were Arab neighbors of Israel that were even signatories to the Khartoum Agreement, which happened in the 70s in Sudan, which was a group of Arab countries that said about Israel, no recognition, no peace, no trade, nothing. Even signatories of that agreement are now saying, we will formally sign peace and trade accords with you. So we have this with the United Arab Emirates, and they're a huge one. There's a couple of other countries, but what Israel, I think, really wants is the Saudis. And the Saudis want it too, because the Saudis are very much threatened by Iran. So I think what we're going to see over the next 10 or 20 years is not only countries like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and these other countries that are already signatories to the Abraham Accords. You're going to see the Saudis and, the Jordanians are already doing an enormous amount of trade with Israel, and they do have some peace treaty, and also Egypt has. I think we're going to see more and more of that, even though the population is not necessarily going to agree with it. These countries know that at least temporarily they need to do that. And I think, Iran is in a much weakened position compared to where it was a month ago. And these countries are looking at Israel going, okay, not bad. Like, if this is how you're going to do things, then we want to be on your side because we're afraid of the same regional bully, and we can team up and we can do pretty amazing things with trade. And I think also a lot of these, like if you take the Saudis, for example, or the United Arab Emirates, these in some ways are kind of fragile nations, right? I mean, you have a very small, very, very wealthy group of people at the top, and a large amount of people who are highly poor and dispossessed down at the bottom. And they know that at some point the oil is going to run out, and they're mostly looking towards self-preservation. And the Saudi crown prince straight up told Anthony Blinken a couple weeks ago for the first time, I don't fucking care about the Palestinians. I don't care what they're doing. I'm looking out for my own people. And if that means, signing a peace and trade accord with Israel, we're going to do it. So that was unthinkable even 10 years ago. And now we're moving in that direction. And I think we're going to keep moving in that direction. So is the conflict going to end? No. I mean, certainly what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon right now is not going to, it's not going to make friends of Israelis and Palestinians. But it's possible because 20% of Israel is Palestinian, and by and large, they live in peace. And they do really, really well in Israel. So it's impossible to predict what's going to happen, but I think, I think the next couple of years are going to be really, really hard for the Palestinians and hard for the Israelis. This war has, in many ways, decimated Israel's economy, but I am optimistic that this was sort of the major change that was needed. And it is possible. I just, again, I'm like skeptical that this would happen, but I think it is possible that the Palestinians in Gaza have had their asses kicked so hard that there's the possibility of bringing in a sort of coalition of sorts that's going to help with the occupation and re-education of the Palestinians, right? I mean, as long as Hamas is able to run the education system in Gaza, there will be no peace. Anybody who doubts that should just Google Palestinian textbook incitement against Jews. I mean, these kids are learning from the breast that the highest thing that you can become is a martyr in the service of killing Israelis, and it's reinforced in the education system, and it's reinforced in the Hamas summer camps. Okay, but if Hamas isn't in charge, there's the potential for that to change. But the rest of the world has to step up and be willing to say, we're going to help Israel solve this problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, tell me specifically what was going on October 7th last year, 2023.
We woke up, my husband and I, at about 6:15 in the morning because my husband's mother was calling us and saying, well, maybe it was 6:30. I don't know. It was very early in the morning. It wasn't light outside yet. And she was calling us to tell us that sirens had started going off. It was not unusual, and the sirens indicate that missiles are being shot into Israel. That's what they're there for. So it was not unusual for sirens to go off with fairly regular, intensity down in the city surrounding the Gaza Strip. They didn't often come very far north. And when they began creeping their way farther north, it usually means that they're on their way to Tel Aviv. Now, we live relative to Tel Aviv pretty much exactly as far as we are right now. We're in South Jordan, relative to downtown Salt Lake. We're about half an hour away. If there's no traffic, we're directly to the east of Tel Aviv. Okay, so quite a lot of sirens were going off, and his mom called us to let us know that, and so we woke up to get the shelter ready. Now, every new home, every new construction, every apartment in Israel, including workplaces, are equipped with a bomb shelter. That's part of the building code, okay, which tells you something about what living in Israel is like. And so our guest bedroom is the shelter, and so to get it ready, you have to go in. There's a massive steel plate that slides across the window and bolts into place, and then you shut the window, and then there's like a blast door, and you have to shut and seal the blast door. Okay, so we were getting up and getting ready to to prepare the bomb shelter. In Israel, we call it the mamad, and the sirens started going off. So we ran into the twins' bedroom. We each picked up a baby, and we go into the shelter. And previous to this, there had been sirens in Tel Aviv, but I personally had never heard a siren at our house. And not only did the sirens continue to go off and we were in and out of the shelter all morning, but there were missile impacts really, really close to our house. Now, Israel has the Iron Dome, and what that is a anti-missile battery. It's like shooting a bullet with a bullet. So the rocket, and I'm sorry, from Gaza, they're not missiles, they're all rockets because none of them have any guidance. Hamas kills a bunch of their own people every time they do this because the rockets land short. These guys are fucking idiots. I mean, they're digging up the water pipes to build this shit, okay? So nobody knows where these are going to land. And so they follow a hyperbolic trajectory, right? They go up and then they start coming down, and the Iron Dome is able to figure out, okay, look, once the rocket hits, a certain point, it can say, all right, here's where it's likely to land. If it's in an open area, the Iron Dome doesn't shoot a missile, an interceptor, and it'll fall into the open area and it'll cause fires. But the interceptors are like $100,000 a piece. They're very expensive. So, and then if it's going to land in a civilian area, then it fires an interceptor. So we're in the shelter, and you can hear the explosions from the interceptors hitting the rockets overhead. Okay, so that's scary. And then the loudest fucking explosion I had ever heard in my life goes off, and it was the crosswalk of the kindergarten across the street, and it landed in the crosswalk. Okay, and it hits, and it doesn't make a huge crater because these aren't super super powerful missiles, but it blows the windows out of all the cars and fucks up the crosswalk, and it's incredibly loud. And there were a couple of other rockets that landed fairly close to our house in that day and the following days. And then the footage starts coming out of southern Israel. And the first thing that I saw, I don't have incredibly clear memories of that day, but the first thing I remember seeing was a bunch of white-haired old women dead by a bus stop in southern Israel. And I was like, this cannot fucking be true. This is some kind of sick prank. I mean, these were like 75-year-old women waiting for somebody to pick them up to go play squash or something, tennis, something like that. And they're clearly dead. I mean, there's blood all over the place, and they've been shot in the head. And okay, so I saw that, and I was like, to my husband, this can't be true. And he was like, Of course this is true, but still at that point, like, nobody knew what was happening. And then more and more footage started to come out. And there was video that people had taken of their homes in that city that I mentioned earlier, Sderot, that's right next to the Gaza Strip, of white pickup trucks with armed guys driving around on the back of them, just fucking shooting everybody. And they'd get down off the truck and they'd shoot an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, into the windshield of a car, into its engine block, and then they'd shoot the occupants of the car, and then videos of them dragging the bodies out and stomping on them and putting them in the truck, later to take them back to Gaza. We didn't know that yet. I will never see a white pickup truck with the sort of triangular bars on the sides that people can hang on to when they're driving. I'll never see that again without my heart stopping. And then the footage started coming out of the Nova Music Festival, which was a rave that Hamas parachuted. Not that they didn't use parachutes, they used hang gliders, that they came into, and they just massacred these kids. There's a teenage brother and sister in my building that died. A son of a woman in my book club who was my age was living down in one of the kibbutzim down around the Gaza Strip. And you have to understand that the people that live in these kibbutzim are living there knowing that they're right next to the Gaza Strip. They know it's not the safest place in Israel to live. And these are the people that are the most dedicated to the cause of peace, okay? These are the people who go to the border with Gaza and take the people who need cancer treatments and drive them in their own cars to the hospital to get treatments and then take them home. And these are the people that Hamas targeted. And they knew that. So this young guy, my age, is a peacenik, and he's hiding in a closet, and he's covering the body of a woman, and they shoot through the closet, and they kill this guy. And they take the woman, she lives, she's injured, but she lives. They take her into Gaza, and she was released as part of the first and only round of hostages that came out. And over the next 2 or 3 days, it's like not only are we constantly in and out of the bomb shelter, but the magnitude of what happened is becoming increasingly clear. And we're seeing the videos of hostages screaming as they're being taken back into Gaza. And Hamas was wearing GoPros when they did this, and they filmed it. And some of that footage started coming out. And I've seen things now at this point that have changed me for the rest of my life. You cannot watch anybody hacking the head off of this guy was from Thailand. He was there as part of like an agricultural educational project. Okay, he's not fucking Israeli, and he doesn't look Israeli, and he doesn't speak Hebrew, and they know that. And this guy's still alive. And the guy recording this is hacking off his head with a shovel, screaming Allahu Akbar. And the guy's body is jumping around every time the shovel hits. Okay. You don't see something like that without it fundamentally changing the things that you're willing to believe about people. Okay. And I don't think I was a naive person before. I will believe anything about people now, literally anything, because I've seen them do things with such. And it wasn't just that they were doing it. It was like
They were celebrating
they were
it.
fucking ecstatic, happier than I've ever been in my life, except for maybe when my kids were born, you know? Just not only are we happy to be doing this, but this is our life's mission and God is celebrating and this is for our children and this is everything. It was like calling their parents and saying, Dad, I just killed 10 Jews. I'm calling you from one of the Jews' phones. Like, Dad, and the dad's going, God is great. God is great. Thank God, you know, and the mom's saying, God bless you. Get home safe. I mean, you just, we left, I think, 4 days after that. And it was very, very hard to get tickets out because everybody was leaving. I mean, the State Department was evacuating people on ships and planes. And we found a ticket into Cyprus, which was the only place that had a flight. And we flew into Cyprus together. And then a few days later, my brother met us there and then flew back with me to the United States. And while we were in Cyprus, so my husband is very, now if you and I were in Israel, because we're not from here, I'm a little better at it now, but still not very good. You can't tell who's Jewish and who's Arab. You kind of can sometimes, but it's not a skin thing. It's not a race thing. It's not even a religious garb thing, unless you really know the difference between like a hijab and you know, like what religious women, Jewish women use to cover their hair. But if you're from that area or if you're Arab, you know that my husband is a Persian Jew. His parents were part of that giant push of Jews out of the Middle East. His mom is from Iraq. His dad is from Iran. And my husband looks like a Persian Jew. And his English is really good. He's a very smart guy. So you can't necessarily hear from how he's talking, but to look at him, you know. And he's very handsome. So it's nice to look at him. But he's there with us in Cyprus, and Cyprus is divided between two halves. You've got the Turkish half and you've got the Greek half. And Turkey is an Islamic country, and it's got lots of Islamic extremists, and the Greek authorities have a list of Turkish Islamist extremists that are in the Greek side that they watch. So we fly into Cyprus, and our flight was initially into one part of the Greek side, and they changed it last minute, and I thought it was going to get canceled, and thank God it didn't, over to the other side. And so we ended up having to take a bus in the middle of the night with these two tiny kids over to the other side of the island because there's no fucking hotels in the part that we flew into because all the Israelis were trying to get out. And at one point, we had to switch buses to get to the other place, but I didn't know that, and my husband didn't know it. And we pull over in the middle of the night, and it's dark, and there's no fucking street lights. And we were like, "Is this the part where the Arabs get on the bus and we all die?" I cannot explain to you, because I've never felt it before, because I grew up Mormon in Utah. I cannot explain to you the level of paranoia and fear that we had. Like when I was packing, I took out everything that could possibly identify us as being Israeli. I unpacked all the kids' diapers. I took the labels off the formula. We didn't bring any cash. I cut the tags off the clothes. Like anything that would suggest that we were from Israel. All we had was like passports and our ID cards. And between that bus ride and between getting to the airport, and they had guards at the airport that were really heavily armed because they knew Israelis were coming in and they were afraid that they might get attacked by, Muslim Turks. And then we stayed at this hotel in Cyprus, and we're sitting in the hotel room the whole time because we don't dare go out. And I'm going to the grocery store, and my husband's staying with the kids, And I'm like, don't fucking speak Hebrew on the phone. Like, your parents called, turn the volume down. Don't say anything in Hebrew. Don't say anything publicly in Hebrew. Don't tell anybody. Do not advertise that we're from Israel. And the second morning we're there, we go out to breakfast and we're sitting there with the kids, and the kids are losing their shit because they're like 7 months old. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to take the kids over to the lobby and we'll wait for you, and you finish eating and you come and meet us. The second we leave, this Turkish Arab guy comes up to my husband and started asking him questions. Where are you from? Are those kids yours? Oh, you're American. Are you American? Like, it was weird. And we panicked and we left in like 15 minutes. He came and told me, and we packed our shit up and we took a cab to an Airbnb. And when we were in the Airbnb at one point, we went out to walk along the beach because we thought, there's a bunch of people out here. We're not likely to be targeted. Who should we run into but this woman we saw on the plane? And she was getting her teenage sons out and sending them to live with a relative in Germany. And they're wearing these giant crosses around their necks because they're trying to hide the fact that these kids look Jewish as fuck. And we're walking with her, and she's very friendly, but she starts talking about Israel. And she's like, Tel Aviv this and Hamas that. And we were like, shut the fuck up. Like, what is wrong with you? And there's these young Arab guys, and they're listening to us, And when we said goodbye to her, we're standing in front of a hookah bar, and she's perfect timing. She's like, well, I'm going to go now, but hopefully we'll see you back home in Israel soon. And there's these guys sitting there. And so we walk home, and it's like 20 minutes. And the whole time we're looking behind us, and it's dusk. And if there's a guy on a bike or if there's somebody walking, like, I cannot explain to you how, like, the paranoia. We slept with knives by the bed. I put, a cup with utensils stacked on top of it in front of the door. So if somebody picked the lock or whatever, so we would hear them. They tried to sneak in.
That's terrifying.
It was horrible. It was horrible. I just could not. I mean, it was like being in a horror film.
Yeah. Was that the most scared you've been in your life?
Oh my God. But it's, I hope, the scariest I'm ever in my life.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a level of feeling hunted, and we weren't being hunted, right? Because nobody got us, and we were okay.
You
but
didn't know.
All the Israelis in Cyprus were sitting ducks at that point. And there was then, like, Hamas called for a day of rage where everybody was supposed to attack Jews and Israeli targets wherever they could. And it's while we were there. I mean, it was just, God, I've never been gladder to be in the U.S., and we're in the airport, and this very friendly Muslim family walked up to us. The wife was wearing hijab, and they've got a little girl who was really interested in our babies. And I'm there with my brother, and she's, oh, what are your kids' names? And I say Emery, which is my one son's middle name and my maiden name. And I say the other one is Jordan. His name is Yarden, which is the Hebrew Jordan. But, like, if I tell them his name is Yarden, they go, you're Israeli. They know that. So, I mean, just like to have to hide your own kids' names from strangers at the airport, which is one of the safest places, that is the level of fear. And everybody felt that way. Like, everybody that I knew felt that way. And my husband's not a guy who's easily spooked by stuff like that, and he felt that way. So, yeah, it was pretty terrible.
Well, I'm sorry you had to go through that. I couldn't even imagine being in those situations. We live over here in the generally safe U.S., and the closest we ever came was 9/11, and that's nothing what
But you remember
you
how
guys
the
went
nation
through.
felt after 9/11.
Yeah.
It was like that on speed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, and you guys were in the thick of it, and you had to get out.
Right.
When did you finally feel like you could kind of breathe a little easier? When you were on the plane taking off, or when you landed in the United States? Or do you have never felt like you said?
Well, obviously we got to the U.S. and I felt much safer than I did in Israel or on the transit. But I mean, for the first month I was there, I was just a complete basket case. And I'm usually pretty cool in moments of stress, but I was seeing men out of the corner of my eyes all the time. And I was taking care of the kids by myself, and they were jet lagged, and I was jet lagged, and we all got sick. And all I could do was read. I could not sleep. I couldn't eat. I probably lost 20 pounds. All I did was read the news and take care of my kids. Read the news and take care of my kids. And I couldn't work. Usually I work part-time, and my company was just wonderful and let me take a couple months to just get my shit together. But it wasn't until months afterwards that I could sleep with the light off. Okay. And I'm not, I don't sleep with the light. I'm not the kind of person who feels afraid of.
Well, and you don't see footage like that every day either.
So yeah. 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 And then obviously the footage that's come out since then. I mean, I really encourage anybody who hasn't watched it. You don't have to see the most despicable parts of it. You don't have to watch women get raped. But there's plenty of footage where the worst of it has been expurgated. People's faces are fuzzed out, or you need to watch it because you can't understand what happened and why Israel's doing what it's doing now if you don't watch it. And it's all available on the internet. Everybody needs to watch some of it. You could watch probably 30 seconds and turn it off and be set, Yeah. But Israel hasn't released a lot of the footage because they respect the dead and they don't make a spectacle out of it like the Palestinians do. But I think that's a mistake. And I think the news outlets should. I mean, you remember that picture of that little naked boy in Vietnam running while the napalm was burning. Okay, that changed the course of the war because it changed how Americans saw that. And it was a terrible picture. These pictures need to be seen. And I think part of the failure, the moral failure of the West to condemn what Hamas did and what the Palestinians rejoiced in rather than condemning Israel's response is that they haven't seen it. And the people who have and the people who know, they're a lost cause. They're not interested in being good people. But I think good people who have a moral compass and who care about this kind of thing need to watch that, at least some of it, to get a sense of what that was about. It wasn't about being oppressed. It wasn't about legitimate grievances. It was about religious glory in the torture of Jews. That's what it was about. And you cannot come away from watching that footage believing anything else.
How much of that is still available? Because I know we've scrubbed a lot of 9/11 stuff. That was scrubbed real quick.
Yeah, tons of it. There's
people jumping out of the Twin Towers. You don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's everywhere. And there was
Really?
and there was so much of it. There's also yeah. You will find it if you look for it.
Gotcha. How do you so you said you talk to your husband daily. How do you, I know I'm sure you're worried about him, but what's your level of concern? Do you feel like he's relatively safe or?
I think my biggest concern with him is that he commutes back and forth to Jerusalem every day. And Jerusalem can be kind of a more risky place. Just because it's right next to East Jerusalem and there's a lot of terror attacks that come out of there. But generally speaking, I mean, my husband's pretty smart. He's savvy. He knows what to do. So, I worry about him. I think I'm more worried about him in terms of if Iran decides it's going to retaliate to what Israel's about to do. That scares me. But I think he's okay.
How's he doing with your kids being gone?
Sucks.
Yeah.
It really sucks.
Yeah. I mean, he's missed over half their lives.
Yes.
Are they the only kids you got together? The two kids?
Yep.
And you're staying here with family or?
Yes. Yes. I'm staying with some cousins.
That's good.
And they've been wonderful. I mean, so many of our family have just been spectacular. I mean, if there's anything positive that you could take out of this is, how much people are willing to help in times of crisis. Yeah, I mean, my brother and his wife, when we were coming in, without even asking, I mean, I had said, I need a jacket because it doesn't get that cold there. We were coming at the end, the middle of October. The kids need coats. I need a coat. And we need a couple changes of clothes. And other than that, we're okay. I'll go buy the rest. And they, just on their own, organized this whole drive. And when we showed up in America, they had formula, diapers, wipes, car seats, a stroller, clothes for the kids, clothes for me, money. You know, it was a really, really horrible time. And I don't know that there was anything that would have made it less difficult, except that at the very least we felt very much held in the
And armed the family.
yeah.
Yeah.
Us and strangers, people who didn't know us, people who didn't know anything about what was going on at home, just opened what they had. And, you know, it's not easy. Unless you've ever been the recipient of somebody else's charity, it's not an easy, it's much easier to give than it is to receive. And it was a very humbling time to be so dependent on the goodwill of other people, but people were so wonderful and really made the difference for us.
No, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Not just family, but friends too.
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
strangers.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it was, I mean, could you possibly hope for more, you know?
Yeah.
So my view of humanity hasn't been completely darkened.
Well, you know, I love life, and I'm going to live to 122.
God willing.
And yeah, I mean, barring stuff I can't control. And
No, I mean, we say that, Jews say that as in like it's going to happen.
yeah. Oh,
We
okay.
say like another 120 years at
okay.
every celebration. So you will. I have no
Awesome.
doubt about
No,
it.
I think I will. I think we kind of forge our own path sometimes. But I really count my blessings, like just the life I've had and stuff I've not been exposed to, and which is one of the reasons I was really excited to get you on today, because your story is so unlike anything, A, that I've lived, or B, could even imagine. You know, we had our wars in the past, but not in the last few generations. I mean, 9/11's the closest thing, but I wasn't in the thick of that.
Right.
I didn't have to flee my country to go somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully it's always that way for America.
Well, you know, for as many people as possible. But I feel for you. I don't even know what to say. I feel bad for you and your family and your countrymen. And what's the kind of outlook? I guess you guys are just taking it a day at a time, a week at a time, and
Yeah.
your husband's going to be the barometer to say, hey, it's okay to come back, or is he maybe going to come out here? Or
Well, he has to come out to help us bring the kids back because I can't do them both by myself. Yeah, I think there's a good chance that Israel's going to stage some kind of massive strike on Iran in the next week or two. And then the Ayatollahs are going to have to make a decision. Are they going to back down and humiliate themselves? I mean, they're humiliated anyway, but are they going to back down and further humiliate themselves? Or are they going to fight to the bitter end? And I genuinely don't know what's going to happen, but I listen to a lot of people that talk about this, and I think that their first priority is self-preservation. So I think there's a good chance that we could be going home pretty soon. There's also a good chance that we might not be going home for a long time.
yeah,
This is very hard to know. But I'm trying to be optimistic that hopefully in the next month, maybe 2 months, we will be back home.
good. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Is there any other members of your family that left? I mean, either immediate family or extended family that
No,
left?
nobody
Israel?
else has anywhere else to go. I mean, so all of my family's in the United States. I'm the only one because, you know, I converted and moved there.
Mm-hmm.
My husband's family are all, like I said, descendants of Jews that were pushed out of the Middle East, and they don't have dual citizenship, and they don't have anywhere else to go. Mm-hmm. So, and, you know, I work for an American company and I work remotely, so it's very easy for me to move around, and we have a safe place to stay, and we have what we need. But you know, his sisters and their husbands work there, and their kids are going to school there, and so there's lots of Israelis who have left, but you have to have a place to go. You have to be able to afford to do it. You have to have, some kind of citizenship, or you have to be able to afford to travel if you don't have family somewhere. So they're all still there.
Tell me about your kids.
My kids are the cutest, smartest kids on the planet.
Aren't they? Right? Aren't we all?
No, they're two. I mean, look, I'm obviously biased, but they're two pretty special little guys. You would never know that they were related if you saw them next to each other. If you
So they're not fraternal or identical?
Exactly.
They're not identical.
Yeah. So they're very, very fraternal. One looks just like my side of the family, and the other one looks just like Udi when Udi was a kid.
Wow.
A baby. I mean, they're at an age where you've got kids.
I got one.
Okay, so you remember like 18 months.
Oh, yeah.
It's just utter fucking chaos 100% of the time.
I have heard that with twins, it's not raising 2 babies, it's raising like 6.
Correct. It's not as bad as it used to be because they're starting to play with each other now more now. But oh my God, the first
year I'm sure was brutal.
Oh my God, it was awful. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life.
Oh, I bet.
My brother has 2 sets of fraternal twins, and so we are desperately hoping. We want more kids, but we don't want more twins.
Sure.
But I mean, they're just as cute as could possibly be right now, and they're as healthy as you could hope for. And they're just sweet and friendly. They're too friendly. I'm like worried that they would go home with anybody. And they're just really fun right now.
Isn't that fun?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you don't mind my asking, did the twins happen by accident, or were you on some kind of medication?
No, they were totally spontaneous.
Totally spontaneous?
Totally
Okay.
spontaneous. Yeah. Yes. In fact, the first part of pregnancy for a lot of women is tough, but I had a condition called hyperemesis gravidarum, which is where you're basically so sick that you can't function. Probably in part because I had twins, but my mom also had it with a lot of it. Her mom had it. It's genetic. So by the time we hit the 6-week mark, I was so goddamn sick. I was in bed all day long. And I could smell smells that you just couldn't even imagine. Like I could smell my own skin, right?
Wow.
And it made me sick. Everything made me sick. I was just I lost a ton of weight. I was puking constantly. It was horrible.
And this is 6 weeks into the pregnancy?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh,
and it got worse and worse and worse. And then
Oh.
about 14 weeks, it started getting better.
Oh,
And
wow.
God bless my husband, was the most patient, wonderful guy through all of it. We ended up like boarding our dog, and we moved in with my husband's parents, for a couple of months. I could not take care of myself. But at 6 weeks, we went into the OB for like the initial checkup, and he's looking, and he's all, "Oh, do you see what I see?" And I was like, "Yeah, there's something in there." And he's all, "There's 2 of them." At that point, my brother had already had 2 sets of twins, and I knew how, whatever. And I shouted, and I burst into tears, and I was like, "This can't be. Like, this is horrible."
Shouted with excitement or fear?
No, I was like, "What?"
Or both?
Like, yeah. Like, and of course, my husband's mother-in-law, she's overjoyed because she's double the grandkids or whatever. And my husband was really excited too. But for the first probably 3 weeks, I just felt so sorry for myself. And most of that was because I was so bitterly sick. And then you get over it, and then you get excited about it. Now we can't imagine our lives any other way. And that still being said, I never want to do it again.
Well, not with twins, but you're thinking of more kids maybe?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, one thing I heard this great quote, and I don't remember who said it. This is not coming from me. But the opposite of war is not peace, it's creation. And because war is, in its essence, it's just destruction. And I think a lot of my friends who have gotten pregnant during the war also feel this way, that like, if anything, this makes us want to have more kids, where we're just like, the only antidote to that kind of misery is the joy and the love that you share with the people in your life. That's it. That's like the only redeeming thing,
I didn't want kids for the longest time. I was your typical bachelor guy, didn't even want to get married, always having fun, no responsibilities, no nothing. Met my wife, my then wife. She didn't want kids either. So like, oh, perfect. We're a perfect match. But before we got married, we agreed, we said, if one of us wants them, would the other acquiesce? And we both said immediately, yes, definitely.
Oh, cool.
So we got married, and it was about 4 or 5 years into the marriage. And she took me out for my birthday, and we're at dinner, and she said, I kind of want to have a baby. I'm like, cool, let's do it.
Really?
Yep. And I never looked back. And one of the most amazing moments of my life was hearing that heartbeat, the ultrasound. Um, it really changes you because, like, the thing about the creation, right? Like, this is what it's really all about, all that. There's no more special moment. And it's just been getting better ever since. I mean, my kid's the greatest thing in my life.
You have a boy or a girl?
A boy. Yeah, he's
How old is
16.
he?
He's 16. And he's bigger than me, and he's stronger than me. His hands are bigger than me.
Yeah.
He's faster than me. He's smarter than me.
It's amazing to watch.
He really is. I mean, he's quick, and he's more chill than me, which is unbelievable. But I want more. And my ex and I talked about 3 or 4. Divorce got in the way, but we got 1. He's fantastic. But
Okay.
I hope you have more. I hope you have as many as you want. Is there a number in mind that you guys talked about?
I think the thing that really restricts us, one, is that being pregnant for me is just really, really tough.
Sure.
But also we have to get back and forth pretty regularly between the U.S. and Israel. And that's very expensive, So also, the cost of living in Israel is really, really expensive. Cars cost about twice as much there as they do here. So it's like, you want to have more than 3 kids, you got to get a car that's got 7 seats, and that's, $60,000. And it's just so, not that that's the only reason to not have kids, but it matters, and
Could be a deterrent.
yeah. So I think
Thinking maybe one more.
Yeah, our agreements, which feels good for both of us, is we'll try for 1 more, and then if we feel like somebody's still missing from our family, we'll try for 1 more after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, good. And your husband's okay with that?
Oh yeah, totally. He'd have 10 kids. He loves them, and he's just the most gentle, sweet, patient guy with the kids. And yeah,
Good,
no, so
good.
he'd have 100
That's
kids.
fantastic.
Good. Yeah,
Well, I'm really glad. And I love the family stuff.
yeah,
Like coming from a guy when he was 25 was like, oh yeah, that's not me.
yeah,
And now a few years later, I'm like, yeah. That's...
yeah. No, for a long time I didn't want kids.
Is there anything else you wanted to say about the conflict or the resolution or war in general?
I want peace. I want life. I want that for me. I want it for my kids. And I also want it for the Palestinians. And I think that the Palestinians will find that when they're ready, even among the people who, like myself, are admittedly full of, I don't think hatred is too strong of a word for them for what they did, that they will find a willing partner for that. And I hope that happens in my lifetime.
Yeah.
I really do.
Me too. Anything else you want to say about your family? Kiddos?
I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
Well, I wrap up every episode with the speed round. You ready for the speed
Ready.
round? You're all set?
Yeah.
All right. Now you have to answer these questions as quickly as possible.
Okay.
All right, you ready?
Okay. Ready.
All right. What is the meaning of life?
12
12 what?
kids.
Oh, okay. Beach or mountains?
I guess beach, because that's where I live. Yeah. But I miss the mountains.
Yes or no? Pineapple on pizza.
Yes.
Movies at home or the theater?
Both.
Is the earth flat or round?
It's round.
Mac or PC?
PC for gaming, Mac for work.
All right. Star Wars or Star Trek?
Neither, please.
True or false? Our kids are the best thing to ever happen to us.
Absolutely true.
Barbie or Hello Kitty?
Oh, God, neither, please.
Favorite TV sitcom?
Sitcom?
Yeah.
I actually, oh, you know what? Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I don't really like sitcoms, but I actually think that one's pretty funny.
Gotcha. I'm with you. I dislike 98% of them.
Uh-huh.
Jeans or shorts?
And jeans.
What is best for society, free people or dictatorship?
Free people.
Do you have a hankering for a hunk of cheese?
Always.
Xbox, PlayStation, or Nintendo?
PC games, actually.
All right. Heartbreaker by Led Zeppelin or Heartbreaker by Pat Benatar?
I don't know either of those songs.
All right. Did you have fun?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming
Oh,
in.
my
It was
pleasure.
great talking to you. I think you gave us a perspective that we never could get from the media or any of the propaganda that we hear. So I'm so glad you came in. Thank you. And great talking to you about your kids.
Likewise.
All right. Thanks, Liz.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Give peace a chance. Make love, not war. There are alternatives to fighting. We've heard these sayings many times, yet humanity still goes to war. Here's another quote for you. War is always to be avoided at all costs. You remember that one? It wasn't from the Bible, pop culture, or John Lennon. It came from a woman who in the dark morning hours is awakened by warnings of incoming missiles. With her heart racing and her mind on fire, she and her husband gather their babies, prepare their home as a shelter, and hunker down for the attack. She's practiced this in her mind, but this time it's for real. Huddling with her family and hearing explosions outside her home, she doesn't know what will happen, whether her family will live or die. That woman is Elizabeth Emery Shemesh. She said it during our interview. War is always to be avoided at all costs. Despite the attack she survived and the aftermath she witnessed, she is calling for peace. Rather than shouting for revenge, seeking an eye for an eye, she is asking the world to stop fighting. Our interview took place just over a year to the day after Liz's country was bombed. Over 1,200 people died. From babies to the elderly, innocent people were caught off guard and were massacred. As you heard during our discussion, Liz witnessed atrocities very few of us, thankfully, ever will. Her country in shambles, she fled with her children to the United States while her husband and family stayed behind. And she still says, war is always to be avoided at all costs. If she can say it, most of us should be able to say it too. So how do we stop war? We simply don't war. We just don't war. It's that simple. So if it's that simple, why do we keep doing it? There may be a lot of reasons. You don't like their religion, their work ethic, ideology, government, way of life. Or maybe it's groupthink, group hysteria. Friedrich Nietzsche said, insanity in individuals is something rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. And I think he might be right. But regardless the reason, we decide that no matter what, human life is valuable, ours and everybody else's. We adopt an attitude of, there are alternatives to fighting. We adopt a lifestyle of, give peace a chance. And what of the few that still want to fight, still want to massacre? Then we adopt a defensive position. We prepare ourselves to defend ourselves, defend our loved ones, our homes, our children, and our country. We repel the attackers, and once that's finished, we don't seek a counterattack. No matter how tempting it might be, we don't seek revenge. We do not seek an eye for an eye. We announce to the world that we are not fighting anymore, except in self-defense. We don't have to like each other. We don't even have to respect each other. We certainly don't have to associate with each other. We just have to say, I won't kill anybody anymore, except in self-defense. Some of you might be thinking, well, that's easier said than done. Remember, if you can't say it, you can't do it. When enough of us say it enough times, we will not only be on the road toward world peace, we will also begin to think of new ways to defend ourselves and keep everybody safer. And over time, the remaining few who want to massacre will realize that it's a fruitless endeavor, and eventually, they will stop fighting too. At that moment, we will have world peace. Change begins with ideas. Ideas become thoughts. Thoughts become actions. Actions become habits. So what'll it be? Past or future? Killing or freedom? It's up to you. In every revolution, there's one person with a vision. Be that person. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.